All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Dispersing the Fog. This is March 29th, 2026. Adam Rogers here with Paul Palango. Hey, Paul, how are you?
I'm back.
You're back in your home office, your home studio there.
Yep.
Yeah, made it
Well,
back in one piece.
a brutal 12-day trip.
Oh, yeah. Well, time spent in Ontario as compared to Nova Scotia is always, slightly uncomfortable in comparison, but you had a good trip?
Yeah, we drove. Left here in a storm and went to it's our typical trip. We do everything on the trip. We deliver glass to stores that we're dealing with, save them on the shipping, get to see their operations, in Quebec City and elsewhere. And go to a funeral, visit family, see the agent, um, do some sort of research that we'll get into. It's
Is your
a
now
long ride.
every time you see your agent, is he like, okay, Paul, what's next? What are you working on? Come on, need
We're
another
trying to
book.
work out on what to do next because there's a bunch of ideas. But the problem is Canadian publishing. Canadian publishing is run by Americans. It's Canadian publishing is very difficult to get anywhere because the media doesn't support Canadian publishing, and people are conditioned to reading cheap American pulp fiction and all this stuff that gets Melania Trump puts out a shitty book and sells 500,000 copies. That doesn't happen in Canada.
Like in Canada, it seems like unless you're one of the five books on the annual Canada Reads CBC, like there's just I don't hear any other promotion of books in Canada.
No, there's none going on. And plus the whole effect of multiculturalism is that you've got all these people in their various silos, and the publishing industry is geared towards multicultural. We want new and distinct voices, but there is nothing deep being written or reported or interesting because they shy away from it. People won't read it, or they're stuck in their little silos of what they like. It's very frustrating because I try to do things that are original, meaningful, and not sensational, but well thought out. And there's not much of a market for that.
Yeah, it's yeah, sometimes people are, trying to check boxes and make sure, okay, we're hiring somebody that has all these criteria and they forget about, oh yeah, they actually have to do the job. They actually have to write a good book. And
Yeah, it's so we worked on there's something I've been working on for a while that my agent really likes as an idea, and um, and plus it's from the East Coast, which is the other problem. Well, that's sort of a regional story, whereas somebody can write a story in the States about something that happened in South Carolina, and it's not seen as a regional story. But in America, in Canada, the Toronto-centric view is, oh, well, you know, that's from Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. It has no national implications. And I said, no, it does have, it's basically what I was told when I wrote 22 Murders, a massacre of 22 people by a guy dressed up as a cop. And the initial response from the publishers was, well, that's a Nova Scotia story.
it's ridiculous. I mean, the specific is universal. I mean, whether it's a song or a book or whatever, if you talk about a specific situation and are detailed about it, then that's people can identify with that. And it can be from a certain area. If it's the US, it could be the Northeast, it could be, in
That's right.
the Midwest, it could be wherever. And if it's specific to that area, then people will find it engaging. And anyway, so don't have to water things down for just that reason.
What about you? What have you been doing?
Well, this weekend I actually played hockey. This is not my last tournament of the week or of the year, but my second last. There's a lawyers tournament coming up in a few weeks, actually, here in Nova Scotia. But so I'm a little sore right now. Played 5 games on the weekend, lost in our finals. We had won this tournament 2 years in a row, and lost this year 4-2 finals. Our Only loss of the weekend.
Age catching up with you.
Catching up. Yeah, it's an over 35 division, right? And most of our guys are now in their mid late 40s.
Yeah.
So that's how that works. But no, it was good. I wasn't sure I was going to play this weekend. I have a homicide trial that was scheduled to start, that is scheduled to start Wednesday. And so I was getting ready for that, but we resolved it through a plea deal late last week. So that gave me a little bit of a window. So I was able to go play hockey on the weekend and really enjoy that. So
Well, you
yeah,
know what they say the problem with those leagues, like every good athletes peak at 32. Yeah.
I think that's right. Like I would say as certainly as a competitive pitcher and probably hockey player, between 27, 32 would be when I'd say that was where I was at in
You
my
look at
life.
the stats and the pre-steroid issue, the pre-steroid era. Um, all the big numbers usually before 32,
Yeah.
and then they start to dwindle and taper off, except for the steroid monsters who are still hitting home runs at 38, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Little asterisk there. No, it was good. We had, like I said, we won this 2 years in a row, lost this year. So the maybe the LA Dodgers will see what it's like to try to win three in a row. It's not always easy.
Yeah.
Other teams ramp up like the Jays are. Okay, Paul, this week.
Well,
Listen.
the last part of my trip,
Oh yeah.
I didn't tell poor Sharon, when we've been together since, the late 90s. And she was a glass artist, and then she mixed up with me, and now she ends up on adventures that she never really anticipated. So on this one coming back, I didn't really tell her till we were sort of on the road, um, that well, before I go on the road, what one little plug.
Yeah.
If you're driving down the 401 in Eastern Ontario and you want a good place to eat, we found this hole in the wall Asian fusion place in Napanee, of all places.
Napanee. Okay.
Yeah, the home of Avril Lavigne,
Yeah.
just east of Kingston, a place called Fool's Kitchen, where it's an
Oh yeah.
Asian fusion place. Young guy runs it with his family, 18 seats. We went there on Wednesday night. I took two bites and I booked for the next night because I'm going to bring my daughter and her husband because it's so good. So we had everything on the menu pretty well over 2 nights. Small menu, changes every couple of months. The guy does his own butchering, his own cooking. Everything is homemade. Nothing's frozen. Unbelievable food.
Excellent. Fool's Kitchen. All right. English spelling on that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Fool's Kitchen in Napanee.
Oh, that's great.
Anyway,
Napanee. By the way, Napanee, big softball, fast pitch softball area too.
oh well, softball high, that whole area,
Yeah.
the from Quinte West to Napanee, they have a real sort of infrastructure for youth baseball and hockey and stuff. They're sort of the champs of everything in Eastern Ontario because that area they're really really good. But that's
Okay.
the point I was
That
going.
wasn't the food. That wasn't your point.
The point I was going to make. I didn't tell Sharon where we were going. I said on the way home I've got to stop off and meet someone who was introduced to me by a serious, well-known criminal that I've dealt with over the years. They say you should meet this guy, and so we had to meet this person in an obscure place. Um, it was a diner, but it's not a place you would think of a diner or where it would be. And we went there, and the fellow showed up, and we had an interesting hour and a half meeting, just a get to know you meeting. And as we were leaving, after we left, Sharon says, "Did you see the other guy who came in and was sitting at the table with the laptop, and he was sort of all tattooed and watching us?" And I said, "Yeah, I sort of saw him out of the corner of my eye." I said, "So I guess he was the bodyguard, making sure I was the right, I was not up to anything wrong." And then after we left, I said to Sharon, I said, it's uh, it's kind of funny how you've developed over the years, gone from being the innocent glass artist and now you sit in as my bodyguard."
Yeah, that's true. Hey, you brought your muscle too.
Yeah, she's my muscle. She just bats her eyes and neutralizes everyone. But it's quite
So
funny, like this whole
this
world we live in.
And this person, he contacted you?
Through this other person.
Okay.
I got their number, and then it was like, okay, we'll have this meetup. And yeah, we got into some stuff about bikers that was pretty interesting. Like one of the things that goes on in the biker world nowadays, especially with the big gangs, Hells Angels, Outlaws, the big complaint from the old school guys is that the new guys are all sons of anarchy bikers. They put on their vest and suddenly they're the big shots and they break all the rules and as he and others have said, these people are not very smart and they attract attention to themselves and they do stupid things. And it's not what the way it used to be, you know? It's like a lot of things. It's not the way he said we had standards that you had to earn your rocker. You had to earn all of these things, and you had respect for everyone else. And he says it's not that way anymore. He says it's really sick. And then we talked about the police, and
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I'm interested to see where this goes then. Might be a
yeah.
valuable source of insight going forward.
Well, it's like, we said before, you're in the courts doing your stuff, and I'm out
Yeah.
there. I actually meet with people and talk to people and get a sense of what's going on in the world and how they see it. And it's interesting to see their point of view. You know,
I
the
wonder, Paul, just thinking of the young, the young bikers. I wonder if the sort of overall trend of social media world and everybody sort of putting themselves out there, self-promotional, everybody's a brand, if that has, in any way infected or infused itself into the biker world, where these young guys, the former natural inclination for these guys, I'm sure would have been to be as quiet and anonymous as possible. And maybe now that's not the case.
no, it's not. And I mean, they're struggling to recruit. I mean, one of the things I've noticed over the years is the influx of people from Ontario and Quebec in the biker world who are in the East Coast, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. A lot of heavy hitters, a lot of gang members are down here, and I think, why are they all here? Is it for the cheaper real estate, or what are they doing? Like they're sort of, if you go along the Quebec and New Brunswick border, for example, a lot of them are huddled right along the border. I thought, well, it's interesting. You're coming from Ontario and Quebec, and this is where you're retiring, or doesn't make sense.
Well, it is a nice place to retire. It's also sort of a transportation hub in its own ways there. I mean, you're close enough to the water,
Yep.
whether it's the St. Lawrence or the ocean, and then yeah, you can travel, across the border in different ways to get to the States. Yeah, be a good location for a few reasons.
Yeah, and it's as I said, the funny thing about this fellow that we dealt with, that I knew a lot of people in his circle from my days in Ontario. Like, how did you know that guy? I said, well, he threatened to kill me. And, I knew him from back in the day. Well, how'd you know that guy? Well, I suspected someone's going to hire him to kill me. And then I got to meet him, and then you know, so we became sort of friends.
Slightly different conversations than I had over the weekend with guys that, oh yeah, they're all in their 40s now, but I played hockey with that guy back in midget or in Bantam, and oh yeah, all that stuff. Just catching up and making connections, different ways, I guess.
Yeah, it's I would have never thought I'd end up in this position, but if you last long enough, you get to know everyone,
Yeah.
and it becomes sort of its own sort of diabolical network. So when people and the reason I did this and this all came about was because someone contacted me. The last couple of months, there's been a couple of people contacting me from the outlaw biker world, and I'm very suspicious of who they are, and I'm trying to vet who they are because I don't trust the information I'm getting. And one of the reasons I was happy to talk to this fellow was I'm trying to vet who these people are who are trying to get a hold of me. sort of parts personal safety, part are they really bad guys? Are they setting me up? Are they cops? You
Yeah.
know, like who are they? And I can't get a clear answer. And the funny thing was, I read one of the things to him that was written to me, and like someone else who had gone through this with me said, it's all pretty vague, and I don't know if this person's real or not. Some of the facts are right, some of the facts are wrong. But after Sharon and I left, we had a feeling that he knew who the person was.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, it's tough, right? You got to rely on all of those, contacts, references. It's not like you can look them up on LinkedIn or something and check them out
No,
that way, right?
no, and you got to be careful. You can't just take what anyone tells you. You've got, in doing this, you have to be able to vet them one way or the other, and you can't just rely on the police, because the police don't always tell the truth either. You know?
Boy, and a little bit of a segue there, perhaps, Paul. You say they're having trouble recruiting with the biker gangs. They're not the only ones having trouble recruiting. Maybe we'll get in. We'll talk about the Auditor General's report in a moment, but there's a few different interesting stories to get to. The biggest story in my hockey group chat was the Tiger Woods DUI arrest, where he no alcohol, just back pain medication. But the big stories this week, actually, there was one. Well, there's the staff shortage and the Auditor General's report in the RCMP, but a story that we covered last week, and we were almost the didn't have the glass pumpkin in your hand, but something must have told you that there was more happening here than we realized with the National Police Federation union elections, upcoming union elections. Uh,
Which we talked about last week.
it was crazy. Like we had no idea that this was coming in a way, but maybe we did because here it is this week, and there's some shenanigans going on. Two members of the board have resigned ahead of, union elections, 20,000 members. This is either the largest or one of the largest police unions in North
That's it.
America,
Oh yeah, for sure.
and so a lot of power in those positions. Brian Sauvé, the current head of it, testified at the Mass Casualty Commission. And we hear this week that two members of the board resigned as chair and co-chair of the Nomination Elections Committee for the National Police Federation. Uh,
It's Neil Vade and Jordan Irvine.
yeah, Neil Vade is a staff sergeant and Jordan Irvine is a corporal. And from what I can understand, Paul, they resigned because they were supposed to be in charge of the nominations and elections process, but felt as though the board was trying to control the nomination process and put in their own favored candidates.
Yeah, planned
Yeah,
succession.
yeah. Isn't that
And
something?
you know, as you said, last week we were talking about Brian Sobe, and we referred to other people running for election, and I didn't know uh, there's a huge controversy. I knew there was something going on, and one of the reasons we talked about it last week, I brought that up, that there's stuff going on here. And my nose told me there's something going on, and the civil filings, you
Yeah,
know,
there's a lawsuit over this.
yeah, there's a lawsuit. And you have to think, what is going on inside the police union? Well, as we said last week, Brian Sauvé is the president of the NPF. And I've talked about it in the past, how the NPF was formed in, was it 2019, 2000, yeah, 2019, I think it was finally
That's right.
certified. And Brian Sauvé became the president. Where Brian Sauvé came from, he was an internal, the RCMP had its internal union. It was a company union. And Sauvé migrated from that to this supposedly independent union. But there's a huge dispute in the formation of that because there was another group trying to form the union, and they were outmuscled and outmoneyed by Sauvé, who was able to, as I'm told, was able to dip in and use basically company funds, as it were, to support their case.
Well, there's a financial dispute there. There's one of the other candidates, or who's attempting to be a candidate, is this Corporal Damon Atwood, who's
Yeah.
a law school graduate as well as being an officer. But the lawsuit is over $3.39 million, which has been apparently paid to Brian Solvay and other members of the board. And from what I see, it seems like the issue is over pensions, and they had their RCMP salary, pensions based off that, but now apparently they're getting paid more in these union positions and wanted to have the pensions based on that, their new higher salary.
Well, they're getting
And
paid like three or
yeah,
400,000 a year now.
so
That's
that's
what I'm told.
more than even a police officer makes. And they wanted their pensions to reflect this higher salary, and that was the dispute. So they just voted to do it. And so that's what the lawsuit covers, is that decision, whether that was proper.
Well, my problem with this, and I hear this from Mounties and ex-Mounties all the time. I've been hearing it for 5 or 6 years now. I mean, Sauvé, just look at what happened in Nova Scotia after the mass casualties in 2020. Sauvé, as the leader of the union, came in and essentially made up stories that I could document and show in my books that these are not factual versions of what happened. And he was able to play the media, play the Mass Casualty Commission, and essentially promote stories that were not verifiable. I mean, he's the guy who said, had the Globe and Mail write a front page story. The RCMP had made a textbook response to Portapic when the killer got away and killed another 9 people after killing 13.
Yeah.
What was textbook about that? We have the hidden story. Who killed Corey Ellison? I don't see anyone answering that question, and certainly
Well,
not Brian Sauvé because he's made everyone a hero.
yeah, everyone's a hero and nobody could be cross-examined. All those police officers who
Yeah.
get cross-examined every day in court, he was successful in convincing the Mass Casualty Commission not to cross-examine them under those circumstances. And they brought in an expert witness, well, who was not qualified as an expert, attempted to bring in an expert witness to talk about how traumatized and vulnerable those witnesses would be. And anyway, it should have been an embarrassing situation for them. So,
Well, the big story he made up was the gunfight between Heidi Stevenson and Constable Heidi Stevenson and the shooter Gabriel Wortman, in which the allegation was Heidi Stevenson fired 14 shots at Wortman and wounded him and stuff like that before she was killed. I show with the documents and all the witness reports of the scene. Nobody saw this happen. There were 27 witnesses. But the Mass Casualty Commission bought the story. Statues were made to Heidi Stevenson. There's a Heidi Stevenson Day for her heroism. When she was sent into the job that day, poorly trained, under-supported, and lacking the information she needed. And so he was there to protect the force, not to protect Heidi Stevenson, and sold that story. And if you look at it now, this is accepted wisdom. Well, Heidi Stevenson was in a gunfight. Read the documents, read the story. It didn't happen.
so he's gone from protecting them, and now he's protecting himself and his own territory, because he must enjoy being the head of the union. Because this Damon Atwood, Corporal Atwood, he was, I think, originally from Alberta, went to Ontario to do his law degree, and he was based in Ottawa for a while. But there was some dispute as to whether he was an Alberta candidate or an Ontario candidate, as if that made a huge difference, right? But it's one of those things that bureaucratic systems seem to thrive on, these kind of meaningless distinctions, and so he's out as a candidate, with all of the pressure from the executive of the board.
And the problem is it's been explained to me by people inside the force. The rank and file don't really care, most of them. The ones who care, care. but there's a whole bunch of them. All they care about is their paycheck, their benefits, their sick time, whatever. And that's all they want. And under Brian Sauvé, the government had sort of gone into arrears on giving the RCMP upgrades in pay, and so they got a massive increase last year, the year before, like 20% increase in pay. And people would see this as, oh, there's Brian Sauvé. He increased our paychecks. But as we talked about it last week, how high do they think this can go? Small communities where the RCMP police can't afford it.
No,
And
these
so we're
municipal
getting this
budgets that are being stretched,
collision
right?
happening now?
Yeah. Yeah, small municipal units here in the East Coast, certainly where the RCMP polices are being stretched thin on their budgets, and so there's pressure there. And by the way, we just learned this week just that the Auditor General has identified that the RCMP is way short on their numbers anyway. The staff shortage, 3,400 officers short as in last year. Like
Yeah, it's
incredible.
but the RCMP is still collecting the full fare from communities and from the federal government, even though they're 3,500 officers short,
45.
which is
Yeah.
about what? Uh, what do they have? 16,000, 17,000 supposedly, uniform members on the and uniform police across the country. Call it 20,000.
20, yeah, whatever. It's
So
15,
you got
20% of the force.
15%,
Yeah.
15 to 20% of the force at the minimum is not there. And the RCMP, this report was really, really interesting from the Auditor General because the RCMP always makes the case that it's going to do better. We're on the right path now. We've got it going. We're no, we're on top of things. Uh, the commissioner last week said, we don't have a recruiting problem. Michael DeHame said that we
Yeah.
do not have a recruiting problem. The next day, the Auditor General released a report and said they're 3,500 members short and they can't generate enough recruitment.
So the way I heard Michael DeHame interviewed last week on CTV Question Period about this was before the report came out, but obviously he knew what was coming. And the way so interesting, right? Like, so the Mass Casualty Commission is recommending like a multiple year training program for police officers. Michael Duhame, the commissioner, was saying, yes, we have all kinds of applicants. That's not the problem. The problem, from his perspective, or what he's trying to claim, is getting them through depot and getting them out, getting them out the door. And so there's two aspects of it. One is they're looking at foreign officers and having them qualified. And the other is modifying the training at depot so that those like border guards, sheriffs, other people that are in in the policing or enforcement or security world can get a modified training in the RCMP and all of a sudden they're frontline officers. So are we going to get better trained officers as a result of this? I
No,
don't know.
no. I
Doesn't
mean,
look like it.
I mean, I got a note here from a former Mountie. He said it's a joke what they're doing at Depot. It's a lot of marching around and polishing your boots and stuff like that, and they're not learning a lot about policing. But the whole recruitment issue should be a big political issue because the contracts for the provinces outside of Ontario and Quebec comes up in 2032. Right now, the Auditor General reported that 9 out of 11 divisions in the RCMP are in a critical vacancy state. 9 out of 11. They can't generate enough going on. They're bringing people in. You'll see reports here and there and things on Facebook. Oh, look, join the RCMP. We've got this great training program. You're going to be a Mountie. You're going to make lots of money. Da 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 da. It ain't happening because they're bringing people in. The failure rate or the exit rate, as I understand it, is as high as 90%. People are getting in there, going to depot and going, I don't want this. And then the other complication is then they go join municipal forces.
Yeah.
But the other complication is that the RCMP, what politicians, government, and the population of Canada doesn't realize, most people don't realize, is the structure of the RCMP is so antiquated that it's the problem. That in the old days, on the original RCMP, and even up till just very recently, when you joined the RCMP, you were sent anywhere. You had no choice in where you went. In fact, if you were from Nova Scotia, they probably sent you to Alberta. And if you
Yeah,
were from Alberta, they would send you to New Brunswick. That's how it worked. But because people didn't want to live that life anymore, they wanted to live near, have a life, not be moved around the country. They said, okay, now people who join the RCMP, they can they can decide where they want to go.
yeah,
And that has become a disaster because where they need Mounties, nobody wants to go. Nobody wants to go to an island, a fort, a river, anything that has that in the detachment name. No one wants to go there. No one wants to go to the north. No one wants to go to the lower mainland in BC because it's too expensive. And that's not happening. So this whole policy of letting people go where they want to go, well, everyone wants to go to nice, cushy places. Nova Scotia is seen as a cushy place.
yeah.
Let's go there and live a nice life and make money that they make in Vancouver and have lower cost of living, live like a king.
Yeah, they Duhame was saying that they're looking to recruit from like Saskatchewan and people that are willing to go to the north because now they're flying people in for a week or two at a time, flying them out. Like the cost of all that is enormous, I'm sure.
Well, they get bonuses for doing that and
Yeah,
everything. I think one of the interesting, like the whole process of like hiring foreigners, hiring people, not doing background checks to weed out criminals. People are getting in there and they're finding out after they're in training that, oh, whoa, we don't want you as a cop. We're finding out more about you. Or they find out they don't want to be a cop. It's too hard. But the thing that stood out to me was the Auditor General said the RCMP failed to meet its own processing standards for 97% of applications. If they can't even manage their own paperwork, how do they manage Canadian safety?
97%. I mean, how did they get
97%.
3% correct?
Yeah, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's like the thing is completely out of control. And when I say that, and I've written about it in 5 books, people are like, oh no, the Mounties are the best. Stop reading Facebook. Stop reading TikTok. Pay attention to what's going on, understand what's going on. It's your taxpayers' dollars, and reform is needed. When you've got provinces like Nova Scotia going, well, we're taking the Mounties on, they're the best, and we got the best deal. Do you not understand you're paying for something you're not getting? You're not getting the full service. They don't have those bodies, they don't have those systems in place. Everything is falling apart. Something has to be done.
Just anecdotally, these weekend hockey tournaments, you kind of expect there'll be checkpoints, around the community because everybody's coming home from the weekend, for the weekend, lots of people around and all that, and not a bit, none, none around this weekend. And then another tournament a few weeks ago, there was the same thing. It's
The last point on Karen Hogan, and
yeah,
anyone who's listening to this in the political world, Hogan said, Auditor General Karen Hogan said, this is how the RCMP works. It sets targets for how many people it's going to recruit that fall far short of its needs. Then they fail to recruit as many officers as planned, despite a flood of applicants, because they've got this open policy now. Anyone can be a Mountie, but they can't. They've got this mass of people coming through the door and the mass of people leaving, and the dregs are left there, and a lot of them are not up to being modern police officers.
it's a tricky one. We're all right. So there's modern policing, Paul. There was a big story this week also on not so modern policing, but talking about spying on Indigenous leadership back in the 1970s. You read about this
Oh yeah.
this week? Like this spying program on George Manuel, who's the national chief in the I think 1970 to 1976, and he was being followed around by the RCMP, and so now his I think daughter I think is was asking for an apology. So the RCMP didn't quite apologize. They issued a quote unquote expression of regret, which it's always a little strange to me, Paul, when a government apologizes for something that the government did 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. It's like, well, you're apologizing for something. Yes, you're the same entity. So I guess it's meaningful in some ways, but anyway, I'm always a little that's maybe a side issue, but what do you think about those kind of apologies?
Well, this is the, sort of the cancel culture attitude that anything that happened in the past that doesn't fit with your modern sensibilities should be sort of denigrated, and apologies should be handed out and settlements should be handed out. But what was the world like in 1970s when this was going on? I was there. I remember.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, I
If you
mean,
recall those days.
there was, if you look back, I've written about it. In the 60s and 70s, there's all kinds of turmoil going on in society. Sort of the post-Beatles um, change in the way the world worked, became more liberal. A lot of you had riots in the United States. Detroit burning down, other cities, Memphis, um, Watts in LA, South Central in LA, massive disruptions. Um, People coming into Canada trying to foment things, the government being very sort of conservative, even though it was a liberal government, it was very conservative in its approach to things. The RCMP at the time was both the police force and the security service, which was behind a supposedly a Chinese wall. Security service agents were counterintelligence agents who were directed by the government to sort of protect the safety of Canada. People saw a lot of there was a lot of agitation going on. The government was using sort of its old school ways of trying to monitor what was going on and protect the safety of Canadians. Things changed over the years. The RCMP security service after the barn burnings in Quebec was disbanded and CSIS was created. That created its own set of problems. But the bottom line was there was a lot going on. People
Yeah,
were
you got the
worried.
October.
Like today we worry about Iranian sleeper cells and things like that. It was much more overt. It was right in your face what was going on. And it was a time of turmoil. Yeah, it happened. I'm not sure you'd need an apology, maybe an explanation, but we
Yeah,
need context, some context to explain what was happening, why it was happening.
it was a few things struck me on this. Reading the long, investigative piece that CBC did, and there were foreign nationals coming into Canada, being shown around by, Indigenous leaders. There was connections like that, like, all right, if you take the Indigenous part out entirely and just say, well, foreign national X who was fomenting problems in Tanzania and a few other countries show up in Canada and are being shown around by a local guy, wouldn't you want to keep an eye on that local guy? Like,
Well, isn't that what the barn burnings are about? You had the Black Panthers who were um, uh, involved in all kinds of things in the States. And then they were there with the FLQ, who were the Quebec separatists, who were bombing
yeah,
and
October crisis
kidnapping
going on
people
too.
and meeting and sort of getting together and guns, bombs, all that stuff. You have to investigate that. And a lot of that was going on. That's why the barns were burned down supposedly in Quebec to avoid to cause a meeting between the Black Panthers and the FLQ not to happen. So this was sort of a little preemptive policing, I guess, but they were police. They were security agents
So
because the security service did not have the powers of the police. They couldn't arrest anyone.
the other side of it is it wasn't just the police doing this. There were people close to former National Chief Manuel that were reporting on his activities to the RCMP. And so, it wasn't a one-way street entirely. And the other side of the story that that I thought was interesting, well, I don't know, worth pointing out, there didn't seem to be, other than the fact that they were being surveilled, any other results from that or anything else that happened as a result of the surveillance. There was no, harassment of like anything directly like that. It was just, looking back, apparently they were being followed and surveilled, and there was some people reporting on them,
And the
you
militancy
know?
continued into the next years. You had Ipperwash and other things happening in BC where, Indigenous reactions and protests and things got out of hand sometimes. And there's probably and I'm not disputing that they had a reason to complain, but a lot of this was going on and continued to go on afterwards.
Yeah. So, anyway, story there this week,
You
and
got to protect yourself at some point.
I think so, right?
But the other story that maybe we should touch on too is the that Gladue report story,
Oh,
since
that's
we're
right.
on
Yeah.
Indigenous.
Yeah, you saw. I deal with Gladue reports a lot, so you talk about the story and your thoughts on it, and then I'll give you my talk about some of my experiences with these reports.
Well, Bronwyn Eyre wrote a story in the National Post. Um, the headline was the Gladue principle has caused immense harm to Indigenous women. By giving lenient sentences to Indigenous offenders, their victims are continually denied justice. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. In the recent investigations I've been looking at over the last couple of years, and I've talked about this in the past too, that some of these First Nations communities are overrun by criminals, and they can't get rid of them. Some of them are outsiders who are coming into the community. Many of them are Indigenous themselves. And when they do get charged with anything, a Gladue report comes down, and usually because of their upbringing, whatever, they get reduced sentences and are back in the community. So the victims are living in fear, and these communities are living in fear because there's no solid way to treat people equally under the law. Everyone should be treated equally under the law, but we have this carve out now for people with a racial systemic a background where they were impoverished, brutalized, whatever, gets them a reduced sentence, and I don't think that's very helpful. It's unfair to the victims.
It certainly can be, it's tough, right? Because there's definitely an overrepresentation of Indigenous offenders in Canadian jails when you compare to the general population. It's the same with Black minorities as well, and so
Stop committing the crimes. You know,
it's in a way it's easy, right? Just stop committing the crimes and don't do it. And the victims are almost always Indigenous or Black, as the case may be, as well, because people commit crimes in their own communities. So it is difficult because you get, in Nova Scotia, East Coast, you get the residential school history from the the last two generations before these offenders. And so, people don't grow up with guidance or structure in their lives. And so, is it entirely their fault that they're in this situation of being an offender? Hard to say it's entirely their fault, but everybody has their situation too, and everybody has their burdens, and you have to overcome that. Part of the solution seems to be more Indigenous-led justice organizations and court structures, but that is slow to come along. There's one no full-time court in Nova Scotia up in Wagmatcook where I go regularly, but it's That's the exception and not the rule. And so it's tough because you're not getting the same because justice, the whole justice system is seen as a foreign concept in a way in these Indigenous communities. And so the respect for the law, respect for the institutions isn't there in the same way because it doesn't feel to them that that they're part of it. Um, so there's a lot of problems.
Oh no, and I've talked to some Indigenous people, community leaders in the last couple of years, and they say that the problem is, that you'll get people saying, "Well, we need more Indigenous police officers to police the communities," but that doesn't work because if they're members of the community, then there are social and cultural pressures for them not to enforce the law,
Yeah,
and so things are allowed to slide by. And on serious crimes, when you're holding, restorative justice, uh, we're resorting to restorative justice. Serious crimes are not treated seriously. You've been there. You
yeah, I
know
see it.
better than I do. But just looking at it as an outsider, serious crimes are just being treated as, oh, well, we'll give you a slap on the hand. You be good and see you next week. That kind of thing. And I don't, I feel for the victims. I think people are living in fear in a lot of these communities. And I looked at specifically the area around southern New Brunswick, Fredericton, whatever. There's a lot going on there, and a lot of it, most of it, seems to be tied to a mix between organized crime, bikers, and the indigenous communities, all overlaying each other, overlapping. And it's very, very difficult for the police, the courts, and everyone to deal with. But there's a lot of missing people, a lot of bad things going on there,
It's
and it's
yeah.
not being dealt with.
It's tough, and like I say, part of the solution seems to be Indigenous-led organizations. However, we saw at the Mass Casualty Commission discussion on the Indigenous-led policing initiative in Cape Breton that was a pilot project and didn't go very well, right? So,
That's
there's
right.
you can't live in a theoretical world. You have to live in the real world, and we need solutions that actually
Well, as
work.
I say, I've said before, if I get in trouble and I call the police, I don't care what they look like as long as they're competent.
Yeah,
And they're, that they're there as agents of the law. They're
yeah,
there to enforce the law. And I have confidence in them. I don't care what you look like, what you speak, as long as you do the job in a fair way and treat everyone equitably.
yeah. No, there's situations like that for sure. We've got a few more stories we wanted to look at, Paul. I'll just touch on this one. We were just talking about people. There was a case out of Newfoundland. Talk about victims not getting justice and pe things not being treated seriously. About a month ago, a judge over in Newfoundland, Judge Andrew Wadden, who's a couple of years ahead of me at school, had made some comments about inflammatory rhetoric about bail reform movement, the jail not bail kind of stuff, and let a guy go who had 21 charges on break and enters. It's Justin King, and 2 weeks later, back in jail. Five break and enters alleged, and back in jail. So it's across the board. But the one I really wanted to talk to you about, you may have thoughts on that one too. But did you see the story this week out of Halifax? That the person you might be giving some change to somebody on the at the intersection at Quinpool by the
Yeah.
might not be homeless after all.
Oh, yeah. The police dressing up as homeless people, appearing to beg for money, but walking up to your car at an intersection and seeing if your phone is in hand or if you're
you know
doing anything. And they handed out like a record number of tickets using this. And the homeless people are complaining now because it's making them look bad.
of course now nobody's gonna no, get away like nobody's gonna give them money that they think they might be a police officer. uh
Oh, the police are using all kinds of techniques. I mean, the riding on buses and or in high vehicles and driving up beside people, then pointing them out to cars who are waiting down the road to grab them. Anything to get people without wearing a seat for not wearing a seat belt or using their phones while they're sitting at a traffic light. It's
The dead giveaway in this case was they weren't very good at the squeegee. They couldn't clean a windshield properly, and so that was how I think they were discovered.
but it's the number of people who are using cell phones and texting while driving. Having been in Ontario, like my 5,000 kilometer round trip, at one point we're driving from Guelph to Toronto, and our daughter was in the car, and I was driving, and she said, "Oh, that person's texting." We passed six cars in a row on the 401 where the person was texting while driving. Six in a row.
Yeah.
And 401 was like jammed right up. Like it was moving, but it was like three, four lanes of points moving, but people were there sort of weaving, texting. And I see it with truck drivers the last couple of days. Truck drivers like weaving, veering off the road. Like, what? Why did you do that? What's
Yeah.
going? You must be doing something in the vehicle.
Yeah. And the old presumption would have been drinking. Now I think the presumption is texting, checking the phone, just can't focus on the road for that long. People get an itch and they have to check their phone.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Paul, there was one other story I wanted to talk about this week, and I'm sure you've been following this too. This is a little bit for the law nerds, but I think people will be interested. The Supreme Court of Canada this week was hearing arguments. Unusually, they heard it for 4 days straight, and they were arguments about the secularism law, I don't know if it's C-21, Bill 21 out of Quebec, trying to make it so that public servants in Quebec cannot wear any clothing or symbols that are overtly religious. And so it was interesting to hear. So what's happened, the Quebec government invoked the notwithstanding clause to basically say, well, if these rights are out there, if there are rights being affected by this legislation, of course, if people can't wear a cross, so they can't wear their headscarf or hijab or whatever, of course, that's I guess a re violation of their freedom of religion or their religious beliefs. So the Quebec government invokes the notwithstanding clause, and so the bill would then presumably pass because you're allowed to do that as a government. Well, the Montreal English Language School Board took them to court and saying, well, trying to challenge basically the way that the notwithstanding clause is being used. Okay. And the court didn't seem to give them a whole lot of, didn't seem very persuaded by the arguments this week. Justice Malcolm Rowe, who's from Newfoundland, who was great to hear. He interrupts right away with questions, and when the lawyers don't answer the questions, he's like, "Well, maybe next time you'll answer my question." Uh, uh, it's like, well, if they invoke the notwithstanding clause, what are we doing? That's what it's there for. Parliamentary supremacy over some of these issues, and there's a 5-year sunset clause. So after 5 years, if the voters don't like it, every 5 years there has to be an election. If the voters don't like it, they can vote the government out. And so what's the problem? Um, anyway, what do you think about that, Paul? I mean, there's kind of two versions of how law and religion interact. One is the sort of broad Canadian perspective, which is to say, we're neutral on religion. If you want to wear a cross, if you want to wear a headscarf, if you want to, pray quietly in the corner, well, go right ahead, as long as it doesn't unduly interfere with somebody else's rights. What Quebec seems to be trying to do is following the French Republic, which is to say, nope, we want this all, you know, vestiges of religion out of here, and that's the society we want to create or have. Um, why not? Why can't they do that? You know?
Well, isn't the larger argument here the whole issue of rights. Like everyone, when they brought down the Charter of Rights, what 1984 or whatever, under Pierre Trudeau, this was going to be a great day. We're going to have rights in Canada. But what has happened is the whole rights issue is distorting the country. You look at the legal field. We talked about the Stinchcombe decision, where the government and the police have to reveal everything they've done uh, because otherwise it affects the rights of those who are charged.
Yeah.
And it gets, you get into religion. I'm not as you know, not a big religious guy. If I don't care, theoretically, I don't care if somebody's wearing whatever religious symbol they're wearing or they dress that way, whatever. On one level, but on the other level, if in Quebec they see it as a threat to their culture and their society, there's probably an argument to be made there. I mean, because a lot of the people who are advocating this position are trying to instill their what was normal in their past in the country they came from here, where we're a completely different country. If you go to a country, if we go to Malaysia, for example, I've been to Kuala Lumpur, and Sharon wore a sleeveless shirt outside on 100-degree weather and it was chastised for having bare arms.
Yeah.
You can't go to those countries and be you because you have to follow the local sort of precepts of how you behave. Well, isn't that a bit of that same thing here? I mean, if you don't want to assimilate or follow the rules, I'm starting to sound like I'm a right-wing guy here,
I
but
know. I know. Isn't that something? Like this,
yeah,
this
like
is
it, like
the,
it's I'm saying it, but it seems logical to me that if why did you come to Canada? If you want to come to Canada and have your country in Canada, it's the problem of multiculturalism. Basically what I said about books. We have no real identity, and I think Quebec is trying to hold on to their identity. I mean, whatever it is, they're trying to
yeah.
hold on to it.
I mean, they have a history where the Catholic Church was in charge of things, and there was a reaction back to that, against that, so, this is what they want to do and it's important to their culture, then why not? Some of the because it's 4 days, the appellants would get half an hour or 45 minutes to make their arguments, and then the respondents, but there's all these interveners that were getting 5 minutes and making arguments. A lot of them were in French, so I only caught maybe half or so. But Section 28 of the Charter says that all of the rights in the Charter are to apply equally to men and women. So some of the interveners were trying to say, well, that means that the notwithstanding clause has to only can only come after you've decided in the first place whether this right equally affects men and women. And the justices were like, no, if if you invoke the notwithstanding clause, then there is no right to equalize in the sense gender wise. So anyway, I suspect the court is going to, well, I strongly suspect, I predict the court is going to allow this legislation to stay in place. And in 5 years, if the voters of Quebec don't like it, they can vote for somebody else.
I think that's reasonable. I think,
Mhm.
like as I said, I don't count on the invisible man in the sky to make decisions for me, but I don't think our laws should be and our culture should be sort of as they are in the States, in certain quarters in the States, the divine right of kings, as it were. God ordered me to start this war in Iran, and we're going to have this war with the other God.
There's some absurd sort of, people will try to take it too far, right? And they're like, well, a lot of movies are based on the Christ story, or, Star Wars is sort of loosely based on these things, and Harry Potter's sort of religious. Are we going to ban those movies too? And it's like, come on, that's not what we're doing here. Nobody's talking about that. Just stick to the points.
I just think it gets down to what we said earlier. Under the law, everyone should be treated equally, and there should be no carve-outs in an ideal world.
Yeah.
But we're getting carve-outs everywhere now, and the squeaky wheel is getting the carve-outs. Like you look at the anti-Zionist demonstrations in Victoria. You know, the police have spent millions of dollars escorting anti-Israeli marches through Victoria. And the police have asked the organizers to stop doing this, like stop illegally blockading roads. And the organizers, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to continue doing this. But what would happen if the Israeli community was doing the same thing, anti-Arab? They're
Yeah.
not, there's no equal treatment here. We live in a country where equal equality is the foundation of the law. Everyone treated equally under the law. And when we have carve outs like this makes for I would think a fracturing of society and a fracturing of our common goals. And it's not a good thing.
I don't know. The argument always seems to be, whether it's the Gladue reports or whatever, is like you have to look at the nuances of each individual and know them that well before you can treat them equally, And I think people would have more respect for the law if there was just more simplification. And sometimes you have to paint over a little nuance in order to get there. And it's a balancing act, and I think we're maybe drifting too far in one
Well, we
direction.
have drifted too far, and I think there is a reaction, going the other way now for good reason. I mean, we've got to have some focus here, and we can't keep getting torn all these different ways. But everyone seems to have lost sight of where the ball is. I mean, getting back to policing. There's a problem with the RCMP, but nobody wants to do anything about it.
No.
It's a big problem. It's how the laws are enforced in Canada. It starts with the RCMP and goes down. And if you've got a big hole at the top, like we do, and an incompetent force, somebody's got to do something about it. Somebody's got to make a decision and not just take the easy road, the easiest way out, the least controversial way out, and get caught up in all the identity politics and whatever. Just deal with the goddamn problem and do it right, you know?
Jeez. Strong language, Paul.
Yeah.
All right, so this is great. So we're paying attention to this. The Auditor General is paying attention to this, and we'll certainly keep on the case in future episodes. No guest again this week, of course, Paul, but we've been talking to some people who want to comment on some of these stories and others. So maybe next week and in following weeks we'll bring in some other experts.
Well, we
And
had a couple of people I
yeah,
wanted to bring in, but they're all on vacation this week and they're all
yeah,
traveling. Somebody was driving a car from Florida to Western Canada. We just a bad day for having a guest. But the encouraging thing about this is that all these RCMP stories from the CBC, the Ottawa Citizen, and others, Paul Derry, one of our frequent guests,
yeah.
former RCMP agent, alerted me to uh, the Auditor General report. There's more and more people focusing on this and on the problems than there has been in recent years. And I think that that's a good thing that we're starting to get some pressure. But until the political powers sort of wake up and see the problem for what it is, I'm a little nervous.
Yeah, well, we'll keep on the case at least certainly, and maybe they'll check in at some stage here. But that's great for this week, Paul. Anything you're looking forward to in the week ahead?
More of the same, dealing with, I got a meeting with some producers this week and other producers involving documentaries and fingers crossed, we'll see how it goes, but it's a tough world out there to get anything done.
Yeah. Next weekend is Easter weekend. I think we should still be good for a show, and we'll notify anybody if that changes. But I think we'll
Yeah,
manage to take some time out of the Holy Weekend, and you know we have this big conversation about religion versus law. Well, we still have to do our law to podcast, even on a
love to
religious
do it.
weekend.
As I said, I'm not a big sort of religious festival guy because all the religious holidays, Easter, Christmas, are formerly pagan festivals. The winter solstice, oh, Christmas,
Well,
Easter, spring. You
that's
know,
why I don't feel guilty about taking the days off. So that's how I
Yeah,
operate. 'Cause, all right, Paul,
that's good.
thanks a lot, and thanks to everybody for tuning in, checking out, listening, and watching, and we'll see you next time.
See it. Bye.